we have planned for a long time. But because of university life, it hasn't been possible until today. But today we have managed to make it, and I'm so happy. And I was thinking how to introduce you, Hellina, and the only thing I would say is that you are a PhD student at the University of Berkeley, California, Berkeley, I could say, and you research this fascinating topic, at least for me, of low resource languages and artificial issues around that. But that is as much as I'm going to say by way of introduction, because I don't want to make a fool of myself. But I'm going to invite you to tell us about yourself and about what you do, Hellina.
Yeah, thank you so much, Teklay. And I think you said it all. I am a PhD student, or rather a PhD candidate now at UC Berkeley. It is my fourth year. I'm wrapping up my fourth year here. And my research interest is, as you've said, in natural language processing and human-computer interaction. And I specifically focus on low-resourced languages. And these are languages that don't have a lot of data available. So the type of questions I ask are, what do speakers of these languages need? How do current language technologies fail when we come to these contexts? And how can we build better language technologies to support speakers of low-resource languages?
So I thought we would start with the whole notion of low. You make a distinction between low-resource languages and low-resource language.
Yeah.
And I found that interesting, so you're going to tell us that. But I was writing an email to you in English, and then I was reading your paper in parallel. And I was wondering, the reason I'm writing to Hellina in English is because it's difficult to write email in Tigrinya or in Amharic. And that goes into the heart of the problem that you and I think the general way of putting this is somebody who is using the internet in a language other than English, and somebody else who is using the internet in English have completely different experiences. Tell us why. I think, and this is something that a lot of people will relate to, maybe, or they wouldn't be able to explain in the way that you do as to why, but tell us what is happening here.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with describing what a low-resource language is, the distinction that I make, and then come into those details. So low-resource language, in general, is a term that's been used to describe mainly languages that have limited data available online. However, it's not always as simple as just not having data. Usually, these languages also might have limited number of speakers, or they have a lot of speakers, but they don't have digital tools supporting them. And mostly, these languages are spoken in African, Asian, South American, and indigenous populations. So there are social political factors that play a role in how much resources are available in these languages as well. So the distinction that I made, so I came in trying to study these languages, and in the first paper where I made that distinction was a paper on understanding harms on YouTube in Amharic, where we exclusively said we're going to use the term low-resourced and not low-resource because it is not the language that is lacking resource innately. Rather, it is that the way that we've designed technology or language technologies is not supportive of the community that speaks that language. And as a result, we have limited data available in that language. In that particular case, we were talking about Amharic. However, I do want to say that Amharic does have relatively more resources if we put it on a spectrum as compared to other African languages, or specifically also like as compared to Tigrinya, Tigray, Guraginya, etc. Amharic does have like a little bit more resources, right? So there's also like that spectrum happening, and a lot of factors influencing how much data is available. So that distinction of like the low resource was to intentionally indicate that there's like a design decision that's creating these differentiations between the languages. So after that paper and thinking about the term a little bit more, we wrote this other paper, I don't know if you had a chance to see it, where we surveyed 150 papers in natural language processing for how they define the term low resource. And again, going back to the points that I made earlier, it's not just data, but it is social political factors, it's the number of speakers, and it's also researchers who study these languages. How many of the NLP researchers making tools for these languages actually know them or actually can speak them and are from the community also determines how much priority they get within research. So that's generally the landscape of low resource languages. And then coming to your point of like, why is it hard for us to use the internet in our languages? As a person who is primarily an HCI researcher or human computer interaction researcher, what I've seen through my work is that a lot of the times, like the trend within research is to see what works in English and then adopt that to a particular language. So coming to your point about like writing the email in Tigrinya or Amharic, when you're writing, you're using the Latin keyboard, right? Like, so if you want to type in Ge'ez script languages, you might have to do like a lot of like gymnastics just to get like one character out, right? And that's happening because we have this Latin keyboard. And then when we try to incorporate, languages that use another script into what already exists, there's not really a one-to-one mapping. It means that we have to take extra steps in order to use technologies in our languages. And the same thing for, I don't know if you want to go into discussing about Wikipedia and like the lack of data that's prevalent there for these languages. It's a similar thing of like with Wikipedia, you have this like knowledge repository where in theory, anybody can go and contribute in their language. Anybody can create a Wikipedia in their language and contribute articles, etc. However, the whole setup of Wikipedia is a knowledge preservation system that is primarily Western culture, which requires typing articles and citing other articles, etc. Whereas when you come to a lot of low resource language speakers and the cultures that we have, a lot of our knowledge is preserved orally, or it's passed through generations in stories and in music, etc. And these knowledge preservation systems that are currently in place, such as Wikipedia, I talk about Wikipedia a lot because I have research that focuses on Wikipedia, but it could go for any other online knowledge repository. Usually the setup or the way that articles are produced is primarily rooted in Western ways of knowing and preserving knowledge. I would say it is difficult because we are trying to adopt whatever worked in another context into our cultures and into our languages.
If you could dwell on the Wikipedia thing, Hellina, you say in one, I think it was in a YouTube report, was reported and uploaded on YouTube, but it's a talk he gave. You say that one of the reasons why it's difficult, for instance, to create articles in Amharic or in Tigrinya or Afar Oromo on Wikipedia is because of the way people spell words, because there are many ways. So you mentioned the case of HCI Haile Selassie, and he said that there are 130 ways of writing it. When somebody tries to write an article, it's very difficult whether or not there is already an article about that because of the various ways. And that makes me wonder whether the solution to that might be to standardize spelling. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I have very strong thoughts about standardization. So we have a paper that is currently under review, but we're going to release the preprint in the next few weeks, where we look at, let me first explain the phenomenon that you are mentioning from that paper, right? So in Amharic, Amharic is Tigrinya, a lot of the Afro-Semitic languages, they use the Ge'ez script, right? And the Ge'ez script is set up in a way that you have one base character, and then for every vowel that you have a variation of that character. However, there are certain characters that have the same sound in, for instance, Amharic. And the thing is that not all the letters or not all the characters that have the same sound in Amharic have the same sound in Tigrinya. So, for example, in Amharic, you have like ha, hu, hi, ha. In Tigrinya, it's ha, hu, hi, ha. Right? It's not ha, like you don't have ha twice. Similarly, but there are also cases where like it's the same, like sa. There are two types of says in both languages. There are two types of says in both languages, etc. But the problem is that this script is shared across the two languages. So put a pin on that first. And then the other thing is that the way that we spell sometimes is influenced by the dialects that we speak. So when you talk about standardization, the most likely thing that's going to happen is we're going to standardize to the mainstream dialect. So if you spell differently because you speak another dialect, you're now going to be required to adopt to whatever is the mainstream way of spelling, right? So there's another pin of one. The first pin is that the script is shared. So whatever decisions we make for one language might influence another language. The second is that there are dialects differences. So whatever decisions you make, you're going to ask some people to not use their dialect and instead adopt to something else. So put those two pins, and coming to the paper that I was referring to earlier that we're going to release soon, there has been this trend within NLP, specifically in Amharic NLP, of normalizing homophone characters. And what that means is kind of what you said, but like in a very implicit way, mapping all the words that have these like similar sound characters into one letter. So if you have 6 different versions of ha, you just map it to one ha. So in your data set, you don't have that variation. If you spell Ate Haile Selassie in one way, or like in the 130 different ways, when you're training the model, you only use one version of that. So we did this whole study where we looked at what is the impact of normalizing data sets on the performance of a machine translation. We specifically looked at machine translation. So we looked at what is the impact on the performance of machine translation. And then we also looked at, okay, if we normalize characters for, excuse me, sorry. I'm just gonna put my phone on flight mode. Okay, sorry about that. So if you normalize the characters, which is a type of like standardization, but a very implicit one again, for Amharic, and you use that model to then train a machine translation model for Tigrinya, what is the impact of having those characters normalized in the Amharic version? So going to the first pin of like, there are several languages that use this script. So the decisions we make on one language might affect the other. So we conducted those experiments with Tigrinya as well as with Ge'ez. So taking a model that's trained on normalized characters for Amharic and looking at what does the impact look like for Tigrinya and Ge'ez. And we saw that it hurts performance because in the Tigrinya and Ge'ez case, those characters, not necessarily all of them, but most of them are distinct. So that's another issue. And I won't go to like the other technical details or the other experiments that we run. But however, like I guess my strong opinion against standardization is that it shouldn't be people adopting to the technologies. It should be the technologies adopting to the people. So there are 130 ways to write Azge Haile Selassie. Our search engines need to account for that, right? Like it shouldn't be me forced to just write it in one way. It should be whichever of the 130 I write, the search engine needs to return, okay, here's your article for Azge Haile, regardless of how I wrote it. So I prefer prioritizing adopting to the way that people write because it's really hard to control how people are going to write. So I much prefer designing technologies to account for that variation rather than standardizing and asking people to adopt to the standards that we set.
No, I perfectly understand that. Wouldn't that have solved one of the reasons why they are low resource language? Because the reason they are so is because there is no enough data to train and models or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And if, for instance, people are writing, let's say, in 130 different ways, wouldn't that mean that you are unlikely to have enough data anytime soon to train anything in any meaningful way? Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, so I definitely see your point. I think I'll answer that by saying, I'll go back to the paper I mentioned earlier of how does NLP define the term low resource languages. So one of the points we raised in that paper was that with the current trend of NLP research, where you have bigger models, you need more data. These low resource languages are going to continue to be low resourced. And it's extremely unlikely that we'll get to a point where we have as much data as the language is classified as high resourced, right? So it's almost impossible in my head, at least, to imagine having as much data for Amharic or for Tigrinya as we have for English, for instance, or even for Arabic, which is higher resource, but like less resource than English. It's still very difficult to get to that stage, right? So my response would be, well, instead of chasing those like bigger model, more data type of solutions, what if we think about more efficient models? What if we think about smaller models that are targeted towards solving a particular problem instead of, trying to change things about the language just so that we could have enough data, because we're never going to have enough data at the end of the day. So I do want to acknowledge that you are right in thinking if you have different versions of, again, the term Azge Haile Selassie, your data is going to be sparse in that even if you have like 500 instances of Azge Haile Selassie in your data, they're going to be spelled very differently. So especially if you have like classification models, etc., that does make the task difficult. So I think that there are and one of the recommendations we also make in the paper is that there are cases where these things are not user facing, where like if you're doing classification and you just have a model that is not like directly interacting with the user, it might be okay to apply some form of standardization. However, when you deploy that model and it's interacting with users in a way that like somebody is required to write in a particular way in order to have the proper output from your model, that's where the problem happens. Because specifically with the dialects or the differences in dialects, like it's not going to work, right? Like you're going to impose some sort of like differential between speakers of different dialects, or like some sort of like power structure is going to happen between speakers of different dialects. So I would much rather have models that are like, smaller and specific to a task and work very well, that don't require that much data or that don't rely on like that big of a model to solve particular tasks.
Are you thinking of tools like the Sun point? So the point you're making is that it's not necessarily the case that you need big data to develop effective tools.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So how is that done, generally, so briefly speaking? Like what are the different workarounds that people could use? So if somebody was trying to develop an Amharic-based AI application, for instance, and accepting the fact that Amharic is relatively low resource, how would they go about?
Yeah. So again, this is my HCI brain, just like, raising her hand, of like, I am a firm believer in models or tools that are designed for a particular task. And I say this because, for instance, I've looked a bit into machine translation for healthcare, specifically for Amharic and Teklay. And regardless of how good a machine translation system you have in general, first of all, let's start by saying that machine translation is bad for these languages. But even if it's like decently enough performing in a general case, for example, a conversation, say me and you just met and we are trying to get like to know each other, or it's like a conversational setting, a machine translation tool that is currently like state of the art, it could get us somewhere. It's going to be bad. We could kind of communicate. However, if you take that to a critical case, like the medical setting, it's just going to be a disaster. There's not enough data in general. And if you go to a sector like the medical sector, then it's just going to be really bad. So thinking about, okay, how do we design tools that are specifically targeted towards the medical, or how do we design machine translation tools specifically targeted towards a medical sector, and not necessarily having this, I'm talking about my own research agenda, right? Like not having this vision of like, I'm going to build this really big model that's going to solve everything all at once, but rather break things up and have smaller models that are targeted towards a particular context. And in that case, you are also aware of where your model is going to have a shortcoming. Like if I train it for the medical setting, I know it's not going to work in the legal domain. Like that's just, I did not train it on the legal domain data. So having interventions that are more focused like that is where I prioritize my research agenda. And commenting on Lisan, I've worked with Asme for a bit, and I know his work very well. So yeah, I'm a huge supporter of those types of like community-centered development of AI models. And I much prefer those than like models that just, that are big and just like claim to solve everything for every language.
The reason I asked you whether it was possible to do something that is effective without having big data was, Hellina, because in one of your papers discussed a meme that you use when you talk about these matters, where you say the whole point of artificial intelligence or NLP is you have a black box that is full of linear algebra, and then you feed into it a lot of data, and then something comes out. And if you don't like the output, you don't play around with the black box, but you give it more data. That's the whole point, right? So if that doesn't what you're saying contradict that meme, do you get my point?
Yeah, I get your point. Yeah. So that meme that you're referring to, I took it from a class that I took at Berkeley, the NLP course at Berkeley, where the professor actually used that meme and it's used to describe the trend within AI. So it used to be the case that AI required a lot of feature engineering. So that means selecting individual, like if you're talking about language, like labeling for like specific, okay, this span, it is a subject, this span, it is a verb, etc. Like a lot of hand labeling and a lot of rigor that required you to know the language that you're working on, know how to extract good features, etc. And when the trend evolved into, these like really big models that when you feed data, they kind of figure out the pattern by themselves, then that meme happens, right? Like now you no longer need to like extract the features, you just feed more data. And if you don't like the output, you feed like additional data, and eventually the model is going to figure it out. My point is that I don't think that we're going to have enough data to feed that large of a model for these languages. So what we're doing instead is thinking about, in the current trend, what we're doing instead is thinking about, okay, how do we augment this data? Can we can we use machine translation to take English data sets and create more data in Amharic so that we could feed it to a model? Can we, what other like data augmentation steps can we take? But I think that's because we're locked in with the vision of like, this is what's working for English, and for the other languages, we just need to follow the same trend. I would love for us as like NLP researchers of low resource languages to think more about, okay, what do we have for these languages, and what do the speakers of the languages need, and how could we build that? Not necessarily being following the same trend for English. Just because it worked in that context, it doesn't mean it's going to work for us. So I don't think that what I said contradicts, in that I'm asking for a different research agenda than the one that we currently have, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. I'm going to take it back to Wikipedia and to YouTube, because also you have done a very fascinating research to somebody like me who uses YouTube in English, and it was very revealing actually to me, those findings. But if you could stay on the low resource nature of the languages, if somebody was thinking of developing a chat GPT, last time I interviewed Timnit about this, I kept saying chat GPT or the other way around. I was wrong, but I hope I'm saying it right. Would that be possible then with the data that is already available? Because one of the points is that there are LLM models, large language models. And one of the points he's making is that Amharic and Tigrinya are low resource. So in theory, could somebody develop something like that then?
Yeah, so there have been works looking into adopting like large language models or training large language models for low resource languages. A lot of the times those do involve the data augmentation techniques that I talked about earlier, mainly translating English data into the target language. I know this has been done for Amharic. I'm not aware of one for Tigrinya, but I know of a few specifically for Amharic where they trained with whatever data was available. The performance was not great, so then they augmented with machine translation. The issue that I see, again, the HCI brain flag, just like, raising her hand, the issue that I see with that is, so I think that so think about a Wikipedia article on, I don't know, Injera in English, right? That is usually targeted towards an English speaker, most likely an outsider to the culture. Very unlikely that you're going to write an English article about Injera to an Amharic or a Tigrinya speaker, or targeted towards those speakers of those languages. So the cultural relevance of the article is like, the topic is relevant, of course, it's about Injera, but the way that you talk about Injera is very different for when you talk to someone from the culture versus someone who's like outside trying to understand the culture. So when you use methods like machine translation to go from an English data set into a local language, what you end up doing is like also importing all the cultural biases that exist within the English data set and bring those into the local language. So at the end of the day, you're going to have a model that does like generate text in Amharic, but it's generating text that is that was originally targeted towards an English speaker, right? So it's not going to be authentic, or it's not going to have those like nuances that you would have if you and I were speaking Amharic, or if you and I were speaking Tigrinya. So my red flag, or like my question would be for somebody who does this type of work, or who's interested in doing this type of work, is to ask why. Why do we need a large language model in Amharic? Who is the target person who's going to use that large language model? Who is like, of the Amharic speakers, how many people are going to have access to tools that allow them to correctly or meaningfully interact with such a chatbot? And what is the purpose? So I think if you answer those questions and you still like answer those questions in an HCI way, and you still arrive at, yes, we absolutely need a large language model, and there's no other way that like these people are going to get the information that they need, or like there are no other tools that provide them, then okay. But I feel like currently what we're doing is not asking those questions. We're just saying we have a large language model for English, we see how people use it, that's the current trend, or that's the current state of the art, so let's just do that for Amharic, except we don't have data, so we're just going to translate English data and build a chatbot in Amharic. So I think there's like some sort of disconnect that happens in the way that we approach this problem.
I understand that. But more broadly, in the AI debate, for instance, if that was the only realistic way of developing proper AI models by using LLM models, right? If that was the only way, and maybe there are other ways now, I don't know. It seems to me that one of the assignments that the person who is thinking of developing AI models based in Amharic would have to do is to generate big data somehow. Or no.
That's my problem, is that I don't think it's the only, I don't think it's the way, first of all, for me, like personally, is again, going to my research agenda. I don't think it's the way for low resource languages. I think that we are, like, when we think about, like, right now, the state of the art in English and in higher resource languages is large language models. And we say, okay, how do we bring the other languages that we've left behind or that we have ignored within NLP research for a long time? How do we bring those to this current state? We are, like, ignoring the amount of research that went into arriving at the solution for English, right? So English already had a lot of, like, robust information retrieval systems. English already had robust machine translation systems. So we don't have that for low resource languages. We can't just, like, leapfrog, I guess is the term that people use, to the stage that requires immense amount of data that we don't have, when the basic systems, like we said, keyboards are not working well for these base languages. We don't have, like, spell checkers. We don't have, there's so many tools that we don't have for these languages from the start, that to think of, like, okay, how do we generate more data? It also, for me, it also raises the question, okay, currently large language models or state-of-the-art research is focused on large language models, and we're trying to get these languages to that stage. What happens when tomorrow something new happens within NLP research? Are we going to drop all the effort that we've put in for low resource languages and then say, okay, how do we build whatever is, like, the next state of the art for these languages? Rather, what I'm trying to, like, I guess, flag is, like, what if we ask, what do speakers of these languages need? Is it an information retrieval system? If that's so, like, there's immense research and information retrieval that we could pull from. So what are ways that we could build these systems for these languages with the data that is available for them? And I believe that it is possible to do it. I don't think that building large language models is the only way to solve NLP problems. Yeah.
What are the things that you think should be done for people to use and to start producing content in Wikipedia in those languages? So what is the thing that is standing between the users and Wikipedia at this time today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, going to refer to, like, a few of the points that we raised earlier of the, like, the whole knowledge preservation system that Wikipedia is built on. Even though it's open, even though it's community sourced, the structure is built in Western ways of knowledge preservation. So again, bringing in, like, it requires, you use text and, like, you write articles in text. It requires citations, which we talk about in our paper, of how difficult it is to find citations in these low resource languages or research papers. Yeah, exactly. It's extremely, like, it's very, very difficult to find citations so to support your articles, right? So with all of those roadblocks that are, because we are trying to adopt something that worked in a higher resource case into these contexts, I think that we kind of need to rethink, okay, how do these communities normally preserve knowledge in their cultural context? I am currently interning at DARE with Timnit Gabru. This is my second week of starting my internship, where we are looking at, one of the findings again from that paper was also the dialect differences, like people not understanding certain words in articles or certain words on the Wikipedia interface because they speak a different dialect than what is displayed. So at DARE, currently, we're looking at what are the best ways that we could support different dialects of these low resource languages, and thinking about, okay, how can we shift from a primarily text-based knowledge preservation ecosystem into something that incorporates voice, into something that has, for example, oral archives, something that supports speech recognition. So instead of asking you to type on a Latin keyboard, is it easier if I just ask you to narrate an article and I use a speech recognition system to convert your voice into text that you can then edit if you want to? So thinking about more multimodal forms of interaction, and also remembering that, voice interaction necessarily doesn't always have to lead to text, right? Like sometimes you just want like an audio that you could play where an elder is telling you about some story that you've known since you were a kid. Thinking about more ways of incorporating those like cultural ways that we preserve knowledge into the current format that Wikipedia has. And there are like a lot of interesting questions that we could ask there. For example, how do you edit an oral archive? Like if somebody is telling the story and they make a mistake, or like you want to add a detail into their story, how do you do that if it's a recording of a voice? So there are like, interesting HCI questions to answer there. But yeah, that's currently how I think.
And sensitivity.
Yeah, definitely. But I think one of the questions or the points that we have discussed repeatedly within DARE when I joined as an intern and we started talking about this project is also like, maybe people just don't want Wikipedia, and that's fine. Like maybe it's just like, maybe people from these communities don't want to have their knowledge put on there, and that's fine. I think we say this in the paper that you're referring to as well, of like, there are cases where that is used as an excuse for not building tools to support speakers of these languages. So initially, when we started that project, for example, of understanding the needs of Amharic, Tigrinya, and Afan Oromo speakers on Wikipedia, a lot of the questions that we got was like, oh, maybe like, they just don't want their articles or Wikipedia, so that's why they don't have it there. But as our research revealed, even if people want their articles on there, there are so many like technological and societal roadblocks to having their data on there. Currently, the way that we're approaching this is, we're not saying that Wikipedia is the only way. We are not saying that we need to have articles in these languages on Wikipedia, but we're looking instead at, if people want articles in their languages on Wikipedia, what is the best way that we could do that by incorporating their natural or their cultural context of preserving knowledge, and how could we best support that with language technologies is the question that we're asking. So again, saying that if they don't want it on there, then that's fine.
But do you suspect that maybe that might be an element? Maybe because we take it for granted that everybody wants us to have their knowledge on the internet. That is an assumption, but maybe that comes from a place of bias as well. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. I think the way that I think about it is that our job as researchers, as NLP researchers, as people who are building these tools, is to make sure that if the community wants their knowledge on there, there aren't technological blocks to them having their knowledge on there. The final decision, like just because we build the tools doesn't mean you need to go and put your articles or your knowledge on Wikipedia, right? The decision of what goes on and what doesn't, at the end of the day, is going to reside in the community. There are going to be certain, for example, that you could imagine that there might be certain topics that people or community members generally don't want external people to know. Or, there might be things that, there might be topics that people much prefer stay locked within their oral traditions and not displayed on the internet, etc. But I think that the way that we're approaching it right now is not to say, okay, we're going to build these tools, so you have to then put your articles on Wikipedia, but rather is to say, if you want your articles on Wikipedia, if you want your language represented on Wikipedia, there aren't any technological blocks to allowing you to do that. And once we clear that path and there's no articles on Amharic, like we have those tools and there's still no articles on Amharic, then we could say, yeah, people didn't want their articles on Wikipedia, so that's fine. Making sure that the lack of data is not because people cannot, but it's because people don't want to. And if they don't want to, that's completely fine. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I think a layman way of sort of summarizing the main point of the paper would be that if somebody was using YouTube in English and another one was using it in Amharic and they were looking for the same thing, they would have a fundamentally different experience, right? But give us the detail. That was my summary. Maybe I misrepresented it, but tell us what the findings were.
Yeah. So the YouTube paper, I think, has three main findings. Excuse me. I think it has three main findings. So the first one is that I think for me, I see that paper as like, what happens when we have ignored languages from the way that we build language technologies, and specifically in relation to content moderation. So the first finding would be that because of the lack or the failure of human and automated content moderation systems for low resource languages, people are exposed to policy violating content. So this is like, if people look at the paper, go into detail about how YouTube reported that they do content moderation. So, they have machine translation systems in place wherever human reviewers don't speak the language of the content that they're moderating. They have very limited human moderators in languages other than the higher resourced ones. And the automated systems or the automated classification systems, from what we know within NLP research, don't really work well for low resource languages. So what that means is if you have content that violates the platform policies in a low resource language, it's going to seep through because both human and automated moderation systems are very underperforming for these languages. So that's the first finding. The second finding is that malicious content creators know these loopholes in the moderation system. So they use several strategies to navigate the content moderation system in a low resource language. So for instance, they will have very benign descriptions in English. One of the examples we give in the paper is a channel that says, this channel is about medical advice and skincare. So, it's an educational channel, etc. That is all displayed in English, but then in the same channel, in the same description box in Amharic, it says that it is a content or it's a channel dedicated to sexual content or questions about sexual content, etc. It's like in the same description box, right? But because they have that camouflage happening in English, they're able to navigate the content moderation system. And the other, I'll add one more strategy. There are several strategies that we identified, but I'll add one more of these malicious content creators also using popular search terms as hashtags. So they'll put famous TV shows, they'll put political names of political people or political organizations or whatever was trending in that language at the time. They'll use those as hashtags for their policy violating video. So because the content moderation system doesn't flag the fact that the content is policy violating, they use those hashtags to manipulate the search engine optimization, and their videos pop up whenever you search for that political term or you search for that famous celebrity or whatever it is. So that's the second finding, is that the malicious content creators know this and they use different strategies to navigate the internet and post videos in these low resource languages that violate the platform policy. The third finding is that the impact of these type of videos differs based on the socioeconomic standing of the users that are exposed to such content. So for instance, in our analysis, we saw that migrant domestic workers, particularly women, were exposed to such type of content, or I would say exposed to two forms of harm. First, by being exposed to such type of content, and second, by the strategies used by the malicious content creators who were posting as medical doctors. These women would come into the videos searching for some medical advice, and they end up revealing where they're located, their phone numbers, what type of medical condition they have in the comment section of those videos, because they believe that the content creator is actually a medical doctor. And there has been several work and several research by organizations such as that has shown the lack of access to medical care that migrant domestic workers face. So when they instead go to the internet searching for such type of content, because of this malicious intent of the content creators, they end up falling prey to policy violating content online. So those are the three main findings that I would summarize that work as.
The paper, a situation where when you were trying to use YouTube from the UK, for example, there was a prompt where you were asked to consent to cookies and all other things. But from Ethiopia, there wasn't that. No. I didn't understand why is that.
Yeah, so the UK and Europe in general have much better data protection laws for their citizens, just worldwide, I would say. So they have this thing called the GDPR that requires platforms they have more, I'll summarize it as saying they require more rigor from platforms when it comes to accessing data about their citizens. So when we switched the VPN to the UK, we did 5 locations. 2 were in the Middle East, 1 was the US, 1 was the UK, and then 1 was Ethiopia. So when we switch the VPN to the UK, the first thing that pops up is asking me to consent to have it, like what type of data YouTube is going to collect, and asking me to consent. We definitely don't have that for Ethiopia, but we also don't have it we didn't see it for the US or the 2 Middle Eastern countries that we did this research or focused this research on. So yeah, that was also an interesting finding for me, was just the stark difference of just as soon as I logged in, it was right in my face of this is the data that's going to be collected. Yeah.
What I understood from what he told me was that if somebody has, and I think he mentioned that in the paper, if your content hasn't been flagged by any user, then there's nothing that the system would do if it hasn't itself detected it, and it will remain there. Because Amharic and Tigrinya are low resource, and because the system is very unlikely to detect, even though it is offensive or violates the policy of the platform and all that, it is very likely that it's going to remain. Am I right?
Yeah, I will say I'm not sure. I don't know too much detail about the behind the scenes of how they do the moderation. In my work, what we did see was that it was difficult for people to report. They usually like we asked people, did you report once you saw the policy violating content? And sometimes there was a case of like they didn't know where or like exactly how to report. Sometimes it was the case of they reported, but then they didn't hear back anything from the platform. So there were issues like that we observed, but I'm not sure exactly. Yeah, I would defer to Nuruddin because he's done more research on that aspect.
That there will be AI, and then all the things that are now done manually would in time be overtaken by machines. Is that the thing to say? That was the case, I was going to say that it would then be more slow for Tigrinya and Amharic because of the thing that we mentioned earlier, because it's going to be more to develop AI machines. And that might mean that we are going to be exposed to horrific content for a longer time than somebody using the internet in English.
Yeah, so I would say that I don't know if it's going to be possible to fully automate content moderation because this is like a situation where the content creators are going to evolve their strategies. Like once you figure out a pattern and you try to, just catch for that, they're going to evolve their strategies and they're going to come up with something new, right? So you're constantly going to have to update. Yeah, I think my bottom line is like, I don't know if we're ever going to solve content moderation is the bottom line, I guess. But then I do want to add a little bit on, what are the risks if we use just pure on moderated automatic moderation systems. There's this paper that I really like from a friend of mine. Her name is Farhana Shahid. I can send you a link if you want to add it to the description, where she focuses on Asian communities and Facebook moderation on Asian communities. So this particular paper that I'm referring to had like this example, which I think is really good. I've used that example multiple times. So she was interviewing people who had their accounts banned or flagged for posting content that violated the platform policy. And in this particular example, it was a person who posted, they were taking a stroll in their neighborhood and they saw the kids in their neighborhood swimming in a river, and the kids were shirtless. They're little kids, but they're shirtless, right? Like they're just wearing shorts. And it's very common. Like we see that in Ethiopia. Like it's just a very common thing within those contexts. However, the Facebook content moderation system flagged it as child pornography and banned their account because in a Western context, if an adult posts that type of video, it is, extremely bad, to say the least. So, or it's like a very unlikely context to where it's like a normal or benign interaction. So automating such type of would again bring the question of cultural relevance, cultural context, knowing nuances, understanding that terms that are used in one country might not necessarily carry the same negative connotations in another country, or situations that you observe in one culture where it is perceived as extremely bad might not necessarily have the same interpretation in another culture. So there's so many nuances that are extremely difficult to capture with automated systems. And they're difficult to capture even with human moderation, right? But I will maybe add or tie up this response by saying that I think the main problem, or in my opinion, one of the biggest problems here is the lack of prioritization for speakers of low resource languages. It is not that it's not that moderation is perfect in English. There's still a lot of harm that happens in English, right? But it is prioritized. Majority of the human moderators that are hired by these big tech companies, by these social media platforms, even if they're not from the Western or the English speaking community, they are moderating for English. We have a lot of cases of content moderators hired in Kenya who are moderating for English content on for Facebook or for YouTube, etc. So the focus or the prioritization of which humans do we think it is important to protect from online harm, and I say the prioritization, when I say the prioritization, I mean by the companies who are hiring these content moderators, is I think the biggest question. It's not that we don't have the tools, it's just that who we try to protect is, or who we prioritize is different.
But of course, you make some recommendations to YouTube and that you think they should incorporate people that you start to say.
Yeah, so I think that kind of is what I was trying to say about prioritization, is that if you have people who are using your platform from all of these communities, you need to treat them equally, right? Like you need to protect them equally. So whatever amount of human moderation you're putting into in English, like the harm of being exposed to policy violating content doesn't change, like the degree of harm doesn't change because you're in a different context. You're still going to be harmed by that content. So yeah, it's just, have more priorities or give more priorities to speakers of low resource languages.
Well, I think maybe the reason.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so it's heavily driven by the economic output of users. However, I think that's also why we put in that paper, we put recommendations for governments whose citizens speak these languages to have more requirements from social media platforms who operate in their countries, right? So if the platform is operating in a country, it means that it is getting some benefit. And if that benefit is cut off, obviously it's going to suffer a loss. So governments being more strict in terms of protecting their citizens or requiring platforms to increase protection, which is the point that we raised earlier of when you try to access this from the UK, having that prompt that says this is the data that we're going to collect, etc. So putting a pressure from the government side as well, or the representatives of those countries or of those speakers on the platforms is also, I think, a crucial point to think about.
It's fashionable for various African governments to say that they are taking a lot on AI and all that. But do you get the impression that they understand the problem? So, because for instance, if you were in charge of these initiatives, I have an idea of where your priorities would be because you understand what is happening, right? I don't get the impression that you think they understand the priorities.
Yeah, so I think there are, I do want to acknowledge that there is some really great work actually from Chinasa Okolo, who's been working with the AU for a bit, and she has, focused on prioritizing protecting African citizens from algorithmic harm. So I do see a few people, I've seen the AU make some movements, although it's not enough. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation, right? So there's still definitely a lot of room for improvement, but there are some efforts that I think are somewhat promising, and I hope will continue to progress and be fruitful in the end. But I think that also, in addition to, of course, the hard requirement should be with those in power, it should be with the governments, and it should be with the tech companies who deploy these platforms. But there's also something about community organizations, right? There's also something to say about like grassroots movements. And that's another recommendation that we make in the paper, is to prioritize supporting grassroots movements who engage directly with users who might be exposed to such type of content. So arming people with knowledge and with tools that would allow them to protect themselves, while at the same time putting pressure on those in power to make decisions that are necessary to protect users.
The paper where you describe the innovative ways that people in Ethiopia use to cope with what participate.
Yeah, that's true.
To get some ideas about what drives you, where your interests are. So I'm trying to get a little bit deeper into the black box. And you mentioned algebra and all that. How did you end up here? And what are the things that really drive you?
Yeah. So when I started my PhD, this is 4 years ago almost, I came into Berkeley not really knowing exactly what type of research I wanted to do. I just knew that I wanted to do something in AI, and I wanted to do something that had societal impact. So the first project that I worked on was in building a document organization tool for public defenders and journalists within the US who are processing large amounts of police misconduct data. And I enjoyed that project. It was my first introduction to HCI, and it took over a year. It was about 14 months, and I worked very closely with the public defenders and with the journalists, and I just really loved, being able to build a tool that had like direct impact. I could see the journalists using it in their work, and that gave meaning to the research that I was doing, and I really liked it. So at that time, as I was working on this project, I took the class from which the meme that we discussed earlier came from. So this was the natural language processing class at Berkeley. And so whenever I would go to class and we would learn a new concept. So we learn about machine translation, and then I will go and try to see what exists for Tigrinya, what exists for Amharic, what exists for Afan Oromo in machine translation land. And I would quickly be disappointed because the tools would not work, or the models just don't exist for that language, except. So that's kind of how I was introduced to this like concept of low resourcedness for these languages. And I just like kept being disappointed over and over again. So at that time, I started questioning the type of research that I want to do. And I joined this group or this grassroots movement called Masakani. It is a movement of African NLP researchers all over the world trying to build tools for African languages. And I quickly joined a project on there. It was a very, I don't want to call it a very simple project. It's a project to build a tool to identify stop words. So stop words are like words that don't carry a lot of meaning within a text, or like if you remove them, they don't really impact the text as much. So these are like words that are repeated, and depending on the task that you're performing, it might change. But words like is, was, am, blah blah blah, like words that are repeated and don't like, if you remove them, they're not going to impact your task as much. I don't know to what degree I can go into a detail, but like, so usually like these, for some tasks, so for example, if you have a classification task, sometimes these stop words will create noise that is unnecessary, and removing them is a pre-processing step within natural language processing to clean your data, or to have data that is, that you could use for a classification task, etc. So we didn't have any stop words when I started my PhD. We didn't have any stop words or a tool to identify stop words for African languages. There were some list of words from like, independent researchers here and there, but there wasn't any like organized way of extracting stop words for African languages. So I joined that project, and we built the tool, we published in Africa NLP. It was a great experience for me because, I was interacting with other Africans who cared about a similar problem. And even though the project felt, or like from the larger context of like, training a model and like deploying a model, etc., it felt like a very small detail, it was still a crucial detail in the overall pipeline. And to me, it was also like, wow, like we don't even have a stop word removal tool. Like forget all the other things that we want to build, right? So it was that like I think jump-started my PhD journey within low resource languages. And because I came from that HCI, like that 1 year that I worked on that project that was purely HCI, I had that perspective of like, how do we identify needs? Why do we build this tool? How is it going to be useful, etc. So I started there, and then I spent my second year of my PhD mainly focused on projects that were about identifying what is wrong with the current way that we build language technologies. That is the Wikipedia paper, that is the YouTube paper, that is, I have a few other projects as well that were purely about, okay, like in the current way that we've designed systems, why do they not work for low resource languages? And again, bringing in that HCI perspective of like looking at the user needs and looking at what users actually have the ability to use. So what type of tools are culturally relevant, what type of tools account for the type of needs that speakers of low resource languages have, etc. So that's kind of the journey that I've had. And I think for me, it's also, I'm really interested in language. I love learning new languages, and I love, learning about cultures through the languages that are spoken in those cultures. Yeah, for me, it's what drives my research is just like being able to understand the output of the models that I train, being able to know the details about the languages that I am studying, and interacting with people who speak these languages, and bringing in that like HCI perspective into how we design language technologies.
Isn't it fascinating, Hellina, that sometimes the reason you end up doing some research is because your professor gives you an assignment and you go to dig stuff, and then you discover that there is a lot of material missing, and then you can visit that you are the person who should create that material that sort of fit that gap. And it just reminded me of a friend of mine who is about to defend his PhD in linguistics, and the reason he ended up being interested in that in linguistics was because his professor gave him an assignment to do something in Tigrinya, and he went out to the internet and he discovered that the material that he should have didn't exist. So that was the reason he got interested in the whole thing. It's a similar story in your case. And then if you could tell us, what are now the problems that you think you're going to be grappling with as part of your PhD or going forward in your research as well? Like maybe in layman terms, what are the problems that you think you should solve?
Yeah. So I think that my research agenda, I'm thinking about graduating soon. So I really should figure out my research agenda or like have a coherent story, right? I think that with the work that, go ahead.
No, that would where do you see yourself in 5 years' time?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So I think that I'm very interested in with the work that I've done so far, right? It's been about identifying needs, understanding communities, understanding how communities operate, how they think about their language, and how could we best build tools to support that. So I'm still engaged in a lot of that work. I think the needs finding stuff that I've done in my second year, like in the earlier years of my PhD, really have given me a lot to think about in terms of projects. So in terms of like people like here are like contexts where machine translation fails. So how could we make that better? What can we say about like like how could we think about speech recognition? How could we incorporate these like multimodal forms of communication, etc.? So I think there's a lot of space for me to explore there. I think my biggest research agenda is that I'm interested in more, again, like more context specific solutions than I am in like generally solving everything all at once. So that's mainly where I see my work going. Another thread that I'm currently exploring related to the normalization or like the standardization stuff that we talked about earlier. I'm interested in how the way that we design language technologies has affected the way that we use the languages. So I say this thing, I've said this thing a few times, I think in talks as well, of like, instead of, building models for a language, we're saying, okay, we have this model, how could we make the language fit in the model? So it's no longer there's a language, let's fit the model on the language, right? Like there's a flip that happened there in the trend that I see for low resource NLP. So I'm interested in investigating what are the changes that we've made in how we use language because of the way that technology has been designed. So investigating that a little bit further is something that I'm excited about. I'm also really interested in supporting different dialects of low resource languages. I think we run the risk of, when we say, oh, this text is in Amharic or this text is in Tigrinya, we are obfuscating the variations in Tigrinya and the variations in Amharic. So the work that I'm doing at DARE currently is looking at making those differences explicit, but in a supportive way of like allowing anybody who comes from any context or any dialect to be able to use a tool that is designed for their language. So those are a few of the threads that I'm actively working in.
I think it's an interesting point, the other way around. And this reminded me of the social science paper. He describes a lot of problems happen in the process, and he said that's not the right approach. The right approach should be you study the problem and then you come up with a solution for the problem rather than adapt a solution that was meant for another problem. And that's exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
In the context of exactly. I don't know if you have some time.
I can stay for 5 more minutes. Yeah.
I just want to get you a reflection generally more on artificial intelligence, because there are these AI luminaries who say that AI is on the verge of, taking over everything and singularity and all that shebang. And from you and from Simnit, I get the sense that you think you have real problems here. We don't even have machine translation. We don't even have, YouTube that properly works in Ethiopia. And you're talking about these grand ideas. Is that right?
Yeah, I think I share similar sentiments with Timnith on that point in the way that you've characterized it. I think I had this conversation once with a person who was like, whenever I hear somebody say like, oh, like GPT is amazing, it's done this and it's done that, I just think about the interactions that I have in my own language with GPT, and it just like fails miserably, right? Like it cannot even answer like a basic question. So I think my thought process is that like, it's just, how do I say it? Again, I think it goes back to our priorities of whose problems we think are important. And I think in my case, I care about low resource language speakers because I am a low resource language speaker myself, right? So, and in that context, I don't see AI as with the risks that are currently talked about in the mainstream. Rather, I see AI with the risks of labor exploitation with data labelers, data extraction, etc., with the licensing rights of content creators, etc. So those are the immediate risks that I see, and not the existential or it's going to take over risks, if that makes sense.
Your PhD doesn't become a marathon like mine, and I hope you're going to come back again.
Thank you.
And
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Teklay. It was really fun. I'm happy to have this conversation. I do want to add one thing. The Wikipedia paper that we wrote are Amharic Tigrinya and Afano translations of a summary of the paper. So I can send you the links to those and maybe you could post it to people who might be interested. My dad actually translated the Amharic version. Yeah, so I'm very excited to have that out there.
Yeah, and maybe to our viewers, I should say that I'm going to put links to those papers and material on the description so they could read it. And I promise to them that it's very accessible. The way you have written the papers is very accessible to.
Thank you.
I don't have any expertise in this area. It wasn't difficult for me to understand. So
perfect.
Thank
Great.
you, and best of luck on your PhD.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Teklay. Okay, have a good one. Let's see. Have a second. Let's see. Bye.